Okay, so for the last session of today, let's talk a bit about multi-tenant. But as we'll see, and as I will say a couple of times, I'm not talking about the architecture or whatever. It's really only what is different when you are identifying performance problems in a system where multi-tenant is used. So I will focus only on that specific topic. So as mentioned this morning, my name is Antognini. I'm working for Trivadis for almost 19 years now. And I'm very interested in everything which is related to performance, database design. So also the topic today is related to that as well. Okay. And since I'm interested in this topic, I also published, it was already 10 years ago, the Troubleshooting Oracle Performance book. There was a second edition already 4 years ago. And now part-time, I'm working on a third edition, but never, I don't know whether it will never be published. Let's see if I manage to find enough time. But from time to time, I work on it. Okay. So about today's topic, as I mentioned, is identification of performance problem in a multi-tenant environment. Agenda is quite simple. A couple of slides of introduction. Then we'll see what is different, the three main areas that you have to deal with when you use or you have to identify a performance problem. SQL trace, dynamic performance views, and AWR. Okay, and at the end, some comments about Enterprise Manager, because I know that many of you like to use Enterprise Manager. The performance pages in general are not bad at all. So sometimes it's really nice to pinpoint a problem quite easily to use the graphical interface. Okay. Now, about performance analysis, every time we have to analyze a problem, at the end, the goal of the analysis is more or less always the same. You have to find out what is taking time during an execution. So you have to find out which are the time-consuming SQL statement or PL/SQL calls, if we are not talking about SQL statements. Okay. And for every one of them, usually you need some details, and details are stuff like execution plan, runtime statistics, okay, the resource usage profile, how many IO, whatever, how much time it spends on logs, and so on. So you need to understand if you have something that takes, I don't know, 7 minutes, you have to know what happened during these 7 minutes, how the time was used. These are general, let's say, goal we have when we have to identify a performance problem. I would say nothing new, I hope, here. So, and since we put that, let's say, that goal, the next thing we have to decide is how to analyze it. As I mentioned before, there are different sources of information. Okay, for example, this morning Richard talked about AWR, what you can do with it. Okay, so it's one way to do it. And basically, to choose which one of the different methods we have, you have to ask yourself, first of all, if the problem can be reproduced. If you can reproduce the problem, you know that when you click on a button that starts a batch, whatever, and you have bad performance, then it's quite easy because you can just measure what's going on during this execution to understand at least what's going on. Then maybe it might be difficult to improve the batch, but at least you can understand what's going on. So if you can reproduce a problem, I will say the easiest way to gather some information is to use SQL Trace. Because with SQL Trace, you activate it at session level, you run what is necessary to be run, and then you deactivate it. And if you scope correctly the begin ends of the SQL Trace, you exactly have all the information you need. What is important, of course, is to scope correctly and when to start the SQL Trace and when to disable it. Because sometimes I see people, even though they have to analyze 5 minutes, then they run SQL Trace for half an hour, and then you have to start looking, let's say, in the trace file to find out what is the part which is actually relevant. Okay, so SQL Trace is easy, and it's in general it works well. We'll say the other cases where or some cases where SQL trace might not be necessary, especially if you have, for example, a single SQL statement that is not performing well. In that case, it might be enough to just run it, get some information directly from dynamic performance view, from SQL monitoring, or also from DBMS Xplan, as Jonathan mentioned in the previous presentation. Because we already know the statement, you just try to get more information about the execution time. But SQL trace is, as I said, is a general tool that can be used independent of the number of SQL statements are involved. Now, if the problem is not reproducible, then you have more or less two choices. First is to wait until the next time the problem happens. Sometimes you know that one specific task runs every day at a specific time, so it's not, maybe it's not a problem to say, okay, let's wait tomorrow at 10 a.m. we know that this thing will run and we will analyze it while it is happening. So you do more or less a real-time analysis of the situation. But of course, maybe you not necessarily you know when it will happen again. Okay, so sometimes it's not something you can do. But let's say you can do it. In general, what we do, we use dynamic performance views with, in addition, of course, SQL monitor and so on, just to get all this information we need. Hash in this area is, for example, very important, are a very important tool. And if you can't wait, or maybe the problem, and you don't know when the problem will be reproduced, it happens only from time to time, then is where AWR is coming. AWR is useful because you can say, okay, yesterday, at that specific time we had the problem. If you have some sensible snapshots for that period of time, and for sensible, I mean, if the problem lasted half an hour and you have, I don't know, a snapshot that you take every 15 minutes, 30 or so, it's fine. If, for example, you have a problem which is much shorter than the time between snapshots, it might be difficult to use AWR for that. Because of course, if you have, I don't know, 1 hour snapshots and you want to know how something that runs in 5 minutes goes, it will be really difficult to get more information. The good part is that in AWR, you also have hash information. So maybe you are able to use the kind of AWR data, but not the AWR reports. So maybe you use hash reports for that. But anyway, these are the three tools we have, and that's the reason why these are the three sections of this presentation, because the idea is to show you what is different if you're using multi-tenant with these three tools. Important comment is I'm not, as I said before, I'm not talking about what is multi-tenant. I hope that every one of you has an idea. Okay, I'm not also talking about what is SQL trace, dynamic performance view, and so on. Okay, so the idea is really to see what is different if you don't use, for example, multi-tenant today. As I mentioned this morning, it's just a matter of time. Sooner or later, Oracle will completely support the old architecture, and everyone have to use the new one. So it's really only about time, since every one of us has to deal with multi-tenant. Maybe it's a single tenant environment, but it will be multi-tenant anyway. So let's start with the first part with SQL trace. What is different if you want to use SQL trace in a multi-tenant environment? First of all, there are not, I would say, or no difference compared to non-multi-tenant environments when you are enabling, disabling SQL trace. So the usual ways, if you want it, you can use DBMS monitor, alter session statements on works as before. Also notice that multi-tenant doesn't introduce new feature for supporting multi-tenant. So you do not, for example, there is no specific way to activate SQL trace from a different container. The only exception being if you can connect to the root container, you can basically activate SQL trace for every session which is connected to any of the PDBs of the system of the CDB itself. Okay, because I mean, you see all sessions from the CDB, so it's not a problem to activate SQL trace in one of them. But otherwise, I will say here it's it's quite simple because it's a SQL trace we know. You have maybe an additional view like CDB enabled traces. Okay, with this view, you get information in the same way you use DBA enabled traces in a regular database. You can use this view to get the information about all PDBs inside a CDB at the same time. Okay, but I will say that's something that if you work on a single PDB, because maybe there is in one CDB many PDBs, and if you have only access to one PDB, is something you cannot really take advantage of. But there is a way to see this information. Now, something to be aware of is that the trace file location is not PDB, let's say, specific. So every PDB that is opened in a CDB will open the trace file exactly at the same directory. So if you have many PDBs and several of them generating trace file, you will have a directory full of trace files coming from completely different application. That is something different that was what we are used to. Especially if you want to give access to this directory and hoping to specify this team can access only the trace file of its own PDB and the other team the trace file of a different PDB, that's something you cannot do. Because if you give access to this trace file directory, you can see every file which is stored there. And so this can be a security issue. And so in general, if you really need to, let's say, give access to a group of people only to part of the trace file, the easiest thing is to use the new dynamic performance views, which were introduced in 12.2, because with the new dynamic performance view, you can extract the data which is coming for every CDB. I will show you an example in a moment. Also, be careful that trace file public, the parameter can't be set at the PDB level. So it's something, if you want to use it, you set it at the CDB level, and every PDB in that CDB will receive the same permission on the file system. Okay, but talking about the $diac trace file and trace file content directory, in case you don't know them, the good part is that if I'm connecting, let me connect a sysdba, so I'm connecting with a CDB, okay, on one specific system. And if I do something like select trace file name with a $diac trace file, what I see is basically all the trace files that my trace file directory contains, and there is, as you can see, a lot of them. Okay, because every time you connect to the CDB, basically you get every information. The good part is that if you connect, now I'm connected to a PDB, let's say that I have, in this case, I have also DBA privilege on this PDB, but I have no privilege on the other one. I can basically run the same statement and getting only the trace file that we can say belongs to this specific PDB. Okay, that's the reason why I said before, maybe in a multi-tenant environment, if you really have to specify who can access which trace file, it's better to not give access to the file system as we are used to, but to say, okay, there are views that shows you this information, so we use the views. And of course, there is the trace file that can be used to get some information about the trace file, but then you have also the trace file contents, where you get the actual contents of the trace file. So we can say there are a number of, or let me show you, in this view, there are a number of columns. Okay, there are some information about which part of the trace file or what it contains, and which component generated it, and which session, container, and so on. But the interesting part is the payload. Basically, with the payload, you can get the content of the trace file. So the easiest way to get the content of a file, if you are not able to access the file system, you have to say there trace file name is to get the other view, find out what the name of the trace file is. Sorry. Okay, and then to select this view, and then you basically, okay, that's not a very interesting trace file, but it's basically the content you have in a trace file. So if you do that in, I don't know, SQL Developer, you can just copy paste this content in a file and then use tkprof or whatever profiler you use to do what you usually do. Okay, so the important thing, we can access this information in a kind of secure way. Okay, because we can go through the PDB or the instance without having or needing access to the OS. But what you have to be aware of is that some trace file can contain information about several PDBs. Of course, for when you connect to the system, if you are using dedicated processes, is not the case because you get your own process. But for example, if you run something in parallel, then you might end up having trace file containing data of several PDBs that are not related at all because the parallel slave are the same. Just to show you an example, I have here just a short script. I connect to a PDB, which is called test1. I just clear the trace file identifier, set SQL trace. I run a statement in parallel. Takes some time. If I go at the OS level, okay, I can see that, let me make it bigger. The last files that were generated related to parallel execution server, P1 up to P8. Okay, but again, these are background processes which are available for every PDB, not only to in this case, test1 PDB. So the point is that if I connect with a different user and I execute the same operation, if these processes are not used by somebody else, I might reuse it and let it execute it, or it's not important. Notice that the size right now is about 100 kilobytes. If I do the same ls, I have the same files. Oops. Okay, they are not much bigger some because depending what they did, but the point is that they are the same trace file. Notice the trace file contains information of several sessions. If I do with a third PDB, same story. So basically, if you open one of these trace files, let's take this one, for example, what you have, what is interesting to point out here, this container ID, which is new, okay, in 12, basically you can see, okay, what is coming after this header belongs to this specific container, which is the container 1. If I go down, container 1, okay, here we have, for example, container 5. Container 5, I don't remember which one it is test 2 or 3, but as you see, it's the same trace file that contains statement, and it might also contain, if you use literal, sensitive information. And if you go down, container 6, and so on. So even though, okay, you are not willing to share, let's say, information between different PDBs, for whatever reason, if you use trace file, you might end up having access to data or information you cannot access in a different way. So it's very important to note that this kind of problem or limitation exists. Okay, the only way, more or less, you have to avoid it, or at least maybe not to avoid the problem of reading the data, but at least to have a trace file that contains only what you are looking for, because that solves a problem. If you take a profiler, you say, this is the trace file, let's analyze it. But if it contains data of several operations which are completely unrelated, it's really difficult to find out what you're looking for. So what you can do is to use trace file identifier. So if I run the same script, but this time by setting trace file identifier to the case of the first PDB, I call the identifier test1. If I go to the OS, I will have sorry. I will have some trace file containing, let's see, test1 in the name. So I know this is me, except if you really choose a very bad identifier, but you can at least isolate your content in a specific trace file. The second PDB, I say test2, then you get a different trace file as well. Okay, and in the third one, exactly the same. So the point is at least you can isolate your workload by giving a name that should be kind of unique. So you know, okay, I have a trace file that it contains only what I'm looking for and not something generated by anybody else on the system. As you can see, now I have also the files with test3. Okay, that's a way to kind of work around this problem. Also important to know is that tools like TRCSS have no support for the PDBs. We have seen that in the header there is this container ID. So what someone could expect is to be able to specify it. I want data of a specific container only. But that's not available. You cannot do it. The only way to kind of work around this problem is that since every PDB should have its own service, so you could use the service parameter, okay, to extract the information of one specific server only, service only, okay. But basically, my expectation will be to have a PDB parameter here, but it's not the case. Okay. TKProf. Once you have your trace file, the next question is always, okay, which profile will you use? TKProf is the one that Oracle ships with the binary. It's not perfect, doesn't work well in every situation, but it's interesting to check whether Oracle did something to make us make our life easier to generate, to analyze data coming from a multi-tenant environment. And basically, if you check the new parameter that you get with TKProf since 12.2, there is one parameter, yes, this one, which is called Pdb Trace. So one cool thing, okay, interesting, something which is specific to multi-tenant, given the name. But actually, it's just a name. This Pdb Trace parameter is not specific to multi-tenant. You can use it in any environment. The point of this parameter is just that instead of analyzing a trace file, which is where you start TKProf, basically you can specify user, password, and of course the service where to connect. And TKProf connects the database and gets the trace file contents through the dynamic performance views I showed you before. So, for example, the trace file and so on. So that's also a nice way if you have installed it on your client TKProf, okay, without having OS access to the server where the database runs. You can connect from your client through SQLnet, get the trace information as it was local, and let TKProf analyze it. Okay, so it makes life easier not only in a multi-tenant environment, but in any environment you can think of. Okay, so these are the, I will say, the difference that we have in a multi-tenant environment. As mentioned, is not much. It's more to be careful with the story and where trace files are generated and how to get them. So next point is related to dynamic performance views. So dynamic performance view, we have a bunch of $B views in Oracle. And now, of course, the first thing to recognize is that multi-tenant, a lot of you got a new column, which is the con ID, the container ID. Okay, and in general, there you have container ID 0 for the instance level information. Okay, you get the container ID 1 for the root container, the CDB root, and the two are not necessarily the same. No? And then you have the ID from starting from 2, which are for the other PDBs. So as you create new PDBs, this number increases and so on. So, and this information is available in, at least in all Vidora views I can think of. Now, if we check the dynamic performance view we use, it's interesting to notice that there are some views that provides only instance level information. Okay, so the con ID is always 0. Let's take as example that I want this slide with $SJ. Okay, if I select, and here I am in a container, yes. I'm in the container 3 from SJ. Okay, what we'll see is con ID 0. Okay, that means it's system level information. That also means that if I connect, for example, with sysdba, okay, and I run the same statement basically from the CDB root, okay, you get exactly the same information because there is no difference from where you get this information. You might have a difference if you have access to it, maybe, okay, but not the information you get. Okay, so as you can see in this case, they are exactly the same information because of course there is only one SJ, and Oracle is not providing details how much SJ is used for one PDB or for the other. Okay, so this view also with our stat, for example, which is relevant in case you are doing some performance analysis or can be relevant. It provides always, I would say, information about the whole system. So you cannot know how much is used for one specific PDB. Then there are other views where basically we have two views for the same, let's say, the same information. One that provides the information at the system level, and the other for at the container level. Something like Vidora system model. Okay, you have that view, and you also have the Vidora con system model, and con is for the container. Okay. But what you have to be careful here, depending from where you execute the statement, you can get different information. Okay, to give you an example, let's take the Vidora sys type model, which doesn't provide too much output. It's a bit easier to show. If you do something like container ID, stat name value from Vidora sys model, thank you. Just checking whether you are following what I'm typing. Okay, let's start again. So it's con ID stats name value correctly written in our sys time model. Now I'm connected as a sysdba. First of all, as you can see, I have only con ID 0. That is system level information. Then I have a bunch of statistics that we expect in the time model. Yeah. Now, if I connect the database, not as a sys, but I go with directly in a PDB, and I try to execute the same. This thing is this one. Okay. You see that now I get the con ID 4. And I mean, if you check also the statistics, they are different. For example, if you take the DB time, here we are about 5, and for the whole database was something like 5.3. Okay, so you see in this case, the container I'm connected to is the one that produce or use most of the DB time. And it's also interesting to point out here you have more information than in the second case, simply because some of the stuff, specifically all the background statistics, are not, let's say, specific to a PDB. So if you want to know, for example, how much DB time is using the memory column store to load the data, it's something you can only check at the CDB level, because it's not something specific to a PDB. Okay. So since in this case we have the same view but returns different data, you can ask yourself why there are also the con views. The point is that when you are connected to the CDB roots, you might want to get information about all containers. Okay, So if I get, where is the query? Yeah, this one. I'm in the container, I get only level 0, if you can call it like that. If you add the con thing, and let's put here order by con ID, what you will see is that basically I have several container, also several PDBs here. You have the information about number 6, number 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so on. Okay, but you have no 0 in this case, because the con system model is just information about the PDB itself. So with this view, you can always get, if you are in the CDB, let's say the system level view, or you can get the view of every single container. Okay, and if you are in the container, it makes, let's say, no difference, because if I connect, let me connect into PDB, and I run the, where is the con system model, I always get only the current container, because I do not see what the other guys are doing. Okay, but I would say it's important to see that, okay, as I said before, some views gives you a general view on the system. There is no container-specific view. Other views gives you a different, let's say, different information depending where you connect. And there are also specific views when you're connected to the CDB to get the information about all the different containers. Okay, and here it's just a bunch of views that have this kind of behavior. Okay, and finally we also have some generic views. Okay, there is this third category where basically if you run a query in the CDB, you get all the data, and if you run it in the PDB, you get simply only the data which is relevant for one specific PDB, sorry. Okay, and in this area, for example, with $session, I would say it's a very good example. And now I'm in the PDB. If I do something like con ID, let's say type of with $session, okay, group by con ID type. Of course, I have only information about my container, but in addition, since background processes kind of belongs to the PDB, then you get also some information about the background processes. Okay, but I do not see session of a different, you can say, of a different PDB. And of course, if we connect a sysdba, okay, and we run the same query, okay, we get information about, first of all, different PDBs. Number 1 and number 4 are the only one having connections right now, and also the background processes, of course, because they belong to the system as well. So in this case, this dynamic performance view shows you what is relevant, you can say, for the container you are connected to. Could be the CDB root or could be a PDB. Okay, and the other I mentioned, for example, $SQL as well. If you connect to a PDB, you get only SQLs that are executed or were executed by the current PDB, not everyone's load. Okay. So what is important is that if you have, for example, a set of scripts accessing this dynamic performance view, I would say if you move to multi-tenant, you have to check whether what you have is sensible, in the sense that maybe sometimes you have to change the view to use a PDB-specific view. Or the other thing to be very careful is that if you mix information coming from the system level and other that come from the PDB level, maybe it's not sensible to do so. It depends on what you are doing. But be very careful when you mix stuff coming from different levels, because maybe you end up having something which is not sensible at all. Or in addition, you might also change the script to make them compatible independently, whether they run in CDB root and in a PDB. Also, there maybe it's not always good to do so. It's better to have a separate script that when you run it into CDB, for example, shows you information about a number of containers. But it depends really on the scripts you are dealing with. Okay, but the point is, I do not expect that every script you run in a non-multi-tenant environment will run, also will run, but whether the data you get is what you're looking for, that's a different story. Okay. Since we are talking about dynamic performance views, just a mention about the hash reports. Since 12.2, that was not available in 12.1. If you run an hash report, let me just start it quickly. Hash report. Okay, give us the usual questions. That's not important. Begin time, let's say -5 for 5 minutes. Yeah, don't care. Okay. In this case, as you mentioned, as you saw, I put the period, the kind of output I expect from the scripts, and then a name from the scripts. So there was no PDB specific information. The point is that I run the report from the CDB, and when you are running it from the CDB, just does an hash report about everything. Okay. So there is no separation of the different CDB. But if I connect directly to a CDB local host, it's called 183.0.0 local. And now I'm connected to a specific PDB. Oops. If I run from there, okay, then the type. Okay, and the second question is, do you want information that comes from the root or from the PDB? Okay, and in this case, you can choose from where you want to get the information. In 12.1, there is no difference because all AWR information are in the CDB root. There is nothing outside it. And since 12.2, we can have the information at the PDB level. And so it will just ask you what do you want. If you say PDB, then you will get information of one specific PDB. Okay, that's not important. What is a bit confusing, in my opinion, is that basically the structure of the two reports is exactly the same. So if you compare the reports, if I run the reports that I did now and I specify AWR root or AWR PDB in this case, basically you get the same report. You will have small difference in some numbers, but it's not, let's say, at least for the hash report, in my opinion, is a bit strange that they put in this parameter. I can understand for AWR report, but not really for the hash. Okay, but the point I wanted to make is, if you run these reports, you get this new parameter that is specific to the situation where you are connected to a PDB. The question is whether in the root you have information about which container, the PDB. Okay. So the question is where I get a picture about which PDB is consuming how much information and so on. In that case, you have to do it on the root. Okay, but when you are connected to a PDB and you do a hash report, AWR even is a bit different. Let's say, no, not really, maybe. But the point when you are connected to a PDB and you do a report also based on the root information, you get only the information about the current PDB, not about anything else. So if you need what you are asking, you need to connect to the CDB root and do the analysis from there. Yeah, we'll see that in a moment. Okay, so hash reports, as I mentioned, there is this new parameter that arise only when you are connected to a PDB, but as far as I see, usually it's not, it's not kind of useful or whatever. Usually, if you are in a container, you want to, or in a PDB, you want information of that PDB. Also because you do not have access to the other information in general. Okay, so if you want to have information about several PDBs, then you have to connect to the CDB root. Okay, that was about dynamic performance view. Next point is AWR. What is different in this case? The first thing to know is that since 12.2 is what, as I mentioned before, not available in 12.1, it's possible to have PDB level AWR snapshots. In 12.1, you have only snapshots in the root, which contains information about every PDB in the CDB. Okay, and since 12.2, even though they are disabled by default, you can have also PDB level snapshots. So if you activate it, you get snapshots going on the root, and at the same time, snapshots going on in every PDB. Okay. And then, of course, you have a number of new views with the prefix AWR PDB or AWR root that gives you, of course, information about a PDB or a root. Basically, every DBA-ist view, you know, there is now also 2 additional views, one with the prefix AWR PDB and AWR root, so that you can get information from the different levels. Okay. Now, how to activate it, as I mentioned before, is deactivated by default. You have a new parameter. This PDB auto flush enabled. That must be set to true if you want it. And then you also have to set an interval for the snapshots. In this case, and the example I show here, it's an interval of 30 minutes. Once you did these 2 things, then you will have PDB level snapshots activated. Now, if you have a CDB with lots of PDB, let's say you have 50, 100, whatever, it might be a problem if every PDB is taking the snapshots at the same time. Okay, and that's the reason why there is an additional parameter, which is AWR snapshot time offset, the one I mentioned here. And basically, with this parameter, you can specify, okay, I don't know, few PDBs do the snapshot at every hour 00, whatever, the other 5 minutes later, the other 10 minutes later, and so on. So you can, let's say, move the load of all the snapshots or delay the snapshots in the different PDBs. Okay. Also interesting to point out is that every container, the CDB and every PDB also have its own snapshot ID. Okay, so be careful. Sometimes I will show you also later on in Enterprise Manager. I mean, depending where you are connected, the snapshot ID 50, it's something else, because every PDB and the CDB are independently taking the snapshots during this job that do that. Okay. When you are generating AWR report, again, if you are connected to the CDB, you get all information about every PDB, and we'll show you in a moment, or let's show it now. I have a report here open. This is a report taken, okay, at the CDB level. And the first thing you can see in this report is that at the beginning, after the usual header, you get information about every PDB which was available on this, attached to this CDB. Okay, you can also see the open time, the container DB ID, and so on. So you can see in this case I have 5 containers. One is the CDB root, and then I have the PDB seed, of course, it's always there, and 4 additional PDBs. Okay, so that means that now the report we are looking at contains information about everything, not only about a specific part of the system. Yes. Okay, so the question is whether there are difference between the AWR reports taken at the root and next slide. Just can you wait a minute and I will show you the difference. Of course, there are differences. Okay, but now on the CDB level, so you get information about everything, and some parts, if you scroll the reports, are not kind of, we can say, new. They are exactly the same. Okay, so if you go load profile, you see no difference. It's simply the load profile of the system. Okay, there is nothing specific, I will say. But if we go down a bit, top events, exactly the same. Let's check where the links are. If we go, for example, for the SQL statistics, because SQL, of course, are executed for one specific PDB only. What is interesting is that in those lists, you also have here the PDB name. So basically for the top statements, depending on the different categories, you know, okay, this statement was executed in this PDB and not another one. Okay, so it's an overview of the whole system, but you get some information in some part of the report about the PDB that generated that load. So you can somehow figure out if you have a general performance problem on this system, who is generating the load. If we search by PDB name, okay, you can see there are the different SQL ordered by the different categories. Parse call, okay. You have, for example, at the here ledgeback. It's available in the ledge sleep breakdown. But what is interesting, this information is always only for the CDB root, idea-wise. So there is no information which is more detailed. Ledge me is exactly the same. Here segments by logical reads, for example, you see also the PDB name into it. So depending which part of the system is busy. Anyway, the point is that a report that you take at the CDB level contains really everything which was executed on the system. And so in some parts of the report, you can see the difference. Now, if you execute it at the PDB level now, if you are in 12.1, I mean, you can't. As I mentioned before, the feature is of 12.2. And you are in 12.2, basically you get the same thing as you get for the hash report. So you have the same question, do you want to use the root or the PDB? And again, there is really no difference in structure and so on of the two reports. So basically you get the information about the PDB. But now the difference between a report which is taken from the CDB or from the PDB is summarized by this slide. So here basically what I took is, let me show you, if we go at the top where the links at the beginning are. Of course, it's not the only difference, but it summarizes a bit. So you see this list of the different parts of the report. On the left, you see what you get if you generate a report at the CDB level, and on the right, what you get at the PDB level. As you can see here, for example, the buffer pool statistic, advisory statistic are not available in the PDB. Ledge, as we have seen before, some segment statistic, library cache, blah, blah, blah. There are a lot of stuff which are missing. So for example, for the case that Richard showed us, where we use the ledge statistic to know, okay, is the library, the result cache ledge was causing a problem. Then in this case, if you run at the PDB level, the information would be more or less missing. And so you see a ledge free somewhere, but you don't know which ledge it is. So I would say in general, if you can, my advice is run the report at the CDB level because they provide more information. Of course, if you cannot and you have only access to PDB, you have to use that as well. Okay, but if you can, CDB level reports provides say more information. Okay, and there is basically what I showed you before in the AWR report, and in some of the list, you get the PDB name into it. And that's, I would say, to be expected and good. So, okay, next slide is about a problem you can get if you are upgrading a system. The point is that, for example, you have a 11.2 database and you upgrade it to 12. Okay, usually you are used that all AWR information are available after the upgrade. Now, if you move from 11 12.2 to 12.1 and you're in in 12.1 we are in a multi-tenant environment, what you will discover is basically that all your AWR info are no longer available. They are stored in sysaux, they take space, but you cannot see them through the regular data dictionary views. Okay, that's clearly a bug. It was also fixed in 12.2. So in 12.2, if you upgrade a database from 11.2 to 12.2, you should no longer have this problem. Okay, but be aware that's something that can happen. So if the AWR information are important to you, and in my opinion, when you do an upgrade, they are important because maybe you want to do some comparison how it is now, how it was last week. Okay, my advice is just export the AWR repository, import it somewhere else so that you can just access to this information. Okay, so that's, I would say, it's a major problem if you do an upgrade of a system to 12.1. Okay. So that was about AWR. As I've just seen, here the main feature is being able since 12.2 to have AWR level snapshots. And it's for sure good, but again, if you have access to the whole system, the information you get are more detailed, so it's more useful to analyze a specific problem. In addition, I must say, if you have no idea what is running kind of next to you, it's really difficult to judge whether the problem is really caused by the PDB itself or maybe it's somebody else doing stuff. If you have a good resource management in place, might not be the case. But if you don't have it, a bit again like the example shown by Richard with the load test, whatever, running at the same time, so that we were talking about a different system, but in this case, I mean, everything is sharing the same resources. So it is possible if you do not have a good resource management in place that a PDB next to you is doing a lot of noise and it is slowing you down. And if you have only a PDB level view on the system, of course, you don't really know whether it is the case or not. So for sure, the identification of performance problem when you are using AWR and partially also for the other one, it's more difficult when you are dealing with multi-tenant. So last point of the presentation is to have a look at Enterprise Manager. And here I'm talking only about the last release, 13.3. I would say I didn't really notice difference with 13.2. And I hope that nobody used 13.1. And I didn't really care about documenting how it was 12. So let's talk about the last release that is available now for a couple of months, I think, at the beginning or during the summer. At the beginning of the summer, they provided us 13.3. So what is important to know there? First of all, I would say in general, the multi-tenant support in the performance-related pages is really not good or weak, as I write it. Already more than 2 years ago, I tweeted this message saying that my opinion, it's really not good because depending on which menu entry you click on in Enterprise Manager, you get information from a PDB or from a CDB. Okay, I will show you in a moment what I mean for that. And so the point is that not every page, every performance page in Enterprise Manager, also the last release, supports multi-tenant. So for some pages, you have only a system level view, and other pages you can have both. And what is really bad about that, of course, is that if you want to give access to the people only to one specific PDB and make them able to analyze a problem, then basically a good part of the Enterprise Manager from the performance pages can be used. So the tweet there was, I don't even remember which version of Enterprise Manager it was, but it was a couple of years ago. Anyway, I checked what is the status in 13.3, and the point is that everything you see in with the yellow background here, these are information that are only available at the system level. So you cannot see top activity for one PDB. Simply not possible. The same goes for the performance home, the emergency monitoring, real-time EDDM, and so on. The other which are this yellow background. And the one that have a yellow background, white background, it means you can choose between the PDB you want or everything. And to make it clear, let's just show you what it looks like when you are using Enterprise Manager. So sorry, it's not very fast because I'm connected with a server back home, but it should be, let's say, good enough, I hope. First of all, to have something going on the system, what I have running here, I have several PDBs, but only one is busy doing something with processing some load that I generate with Swing Bench. It's just to, as I say, just to have some stuff on the screen that can be seen. So I have one PDB who is generating load, the rest of the system, the other PDBs are doing nothing. So when you go to the home of a specific CDB, you simply see, okay, something is going on, an overview. You see that some SQL are running. At this level, you also get the information about, or let me do like that. You see the container, which is running a specific statement here. Okay, so basically, at least you get an information, okay, there's some statement running and which container it is. And the same thing can be seen also in here, where you have this tab, containers. And interesting is, I think it's the only part of the user interface that say containers. Everything else is used the name PDB. They're not very consistent, but anyway, the point is that you get a chart where these are the PDBs which are available in this CDB, and as you can see, there is one which has a much higher DB time as everything else on the system. So at this level, at least you know, okay, who is consuming or generating more DB time on my system. But from here, you cannot really drill down or something. I mean, what you will do, usually you go to the performance home or in one of the performance screens. Okay. Now, if you go to the performance home, let's log in. Okay, in the performance home, basically we get more or less the same view on the data. We see system level information. Okay, first of all, at the OS level here, but if we take the second chart, it's only system level information. You see that something is going on, but there is no information about the PDB. Of course, also in this case, you can just click here on the bottom here where you have PDBs. Okay, and if I click there, I see something similar to what we have seen before. So you see, even though the color is different, there is one PDB in this case who is generating most of the load. So at this level, you can at least know, okay, this is the guy who is maybe causing the problem or was a problem, whatever. Okay. So you have a good overview. The problem is that if, for example, you go to top activity, okay, which is usually where I go to analyze a problem, the performance home is not so interesting. But here, what you get is more or less, again, a system level view. You have the name of the PDB here, right? As you can see. Sorry, the two things are not working well together. So you get on this list, for example, for the top session, you see which PDB belongs to a specific session. So you see here there are two sessions on one specific PDB consuming the time. But you cannot really isolate or kind of say I want to see only one PDB in the top activity. And even worse, in my opinion, if let's choose a PDB. If I go back to the home, Okay, see the different PDBs. So let's choose this one. Okay, now if you notice, the header here changed. Okay, before it was written container, now I'm on a single PDB. And now if I say, okay, let me show the top activity of this PDB, the point is that if you notice, the header changed back to container database. Okay, because as I mentioned before, okay, the problem is really that depending where you click, it's not important where you are, which is your current target. You just jump somewhere else. And this is for every of the yellow background menu points is the same story. So if you want to see a single PDB, you can only use, instead of top activity, for example, Hash Analytics. Hash Analytics provides more or less the same information, same layout. I never understood why they keep both in this interface. But the good part that Hash Analytics supports the PDB. So not only you can, here at the top, let me make it bigger, you can choose which part of the information you want to see. For example, you can say, okay, let me show what this specific container is doing. Okay. So now you focus really on one specific PDB only. So you leave everything else you see on the page, if something will be displayed, okay, is only for this PDB. Doesn't look good at all. I still have connection is there. So what's going on? Enterprise manager just died. OMS. No, it didn't die, but somehow it doesn't show me anything. Mm-hmm. Okay. So someone is reporting some. Okay. No, I'm not saying that there are no problem. But this one should work. Okay, we are back to. Let's go to the history. Let's focus on this PDB. I must say, and my server at home where I run this stuff, it's also quite busy because it has something like 20, 30 databases plus the enterprise manager backend and so on. So I do not expect really good performance here. So what I wanted to show you, yes, Hash Analytics, you can, on the one hand, choose on which PDB you are working. Sorry, I lost. But in case that you have access to all PDBs, you can use also the PDB as a regular filter inside Hash Analytics. And what I mean for that is that even though here I select, let's say I select the CDB root, and be careful, in this case, it's also not very consistent in my opinion. And when you are at the CDB level, you see container database, but if you are here, you have the CDB root and you have the container here. So basically, yeah, you have the two choices to get more or less the same information. Okay. Now they get the information of the CDB root, but at the CDB root level, you get information about every PDB anyway. And the good part, what I want to show you, you can use, for example, the load map. I like that to put filters on what is relevant. So I can see, okay, show me the load map of the PDBs. Here you can choose it. So you see over the period of time which is selected and the corner, the right corner at the top. Okay, so here you see, okay, which PDB is using currently more DB time. So it's quite simple, okay. So you click on the largest surface, and what you get is basically a filter which is set here. And this works for PDBs like for any other stuff you can show on Azure Analytics. And for that moment only, if you, for example, go back to activity, now you see only the activity of this specific PDB, except, of course, the red line here where you get the total activity. Okay. So Azure Analytics, I will say it's good because it supports well the PDBs. You can filter on it. You can really work well with PDBs. But again, top activities is not the case. Usually you do not want to click there if you are in a multi-tenant environment. And what I wanted also to say, performance on top. Okay, on the last point, something also, in my opinion, a bit disappointing is that, let's say we go to the performance home. If you want to generate an Azure report, and you have access to the Azure report at different parts of the user interface. But what is really not good is that when you want to generate an Azure report, you cannot ask to generate an Azure report for a single PDB, which seems to me something quite useful. The only kind of workaround in this area is that, as you see, you have also the service name. A bit bigger. You have the service name here, and of course, again, the service name is used only for one specific PDB, I will say in general, so you could use that one. But it's something that I will expect that when you generate an Azure report, and it doesn't matter from where you get this page, there's several positions where you can get it. It's something you cannot do. To me, it seems that I want to put there in a different field the PDB and maybe use the SQL ID or whatever as a second filter. But in this case, you can only put one filter. Okay, so that's not another part where, and again, Enterprise Manager doesn't really support the multi-tenant environment. And I do not think that there are some of this stuff difficult to be changed. And it's quite strange that after, I don't know for how many years 12c is available. It's 3, 4. Don't even remember. I mean, 12.1 is 13, even more, 5. Okay, that's possible. It's a long time ago in any case, and that the main kind of administration tool that Oracle provides is not supporting in so many situations multi-tenant. It's quite disappointing in my opinion. Okay, but that's what we have. Something that it was improved in the recent release is the support of root level and PDB level snapshots. So when if you go back here, if we go in the AWR part, if you, for example, you say, okay, I want to have an AWR report. In these cases, I'm connected to the container database, as you can see at the top. I don't get the choice of PDB or root level reports. But if I choose one specific PDB, okay, then what we get, as you can see, you can choose at the top between the root level and the PDB level. Okay, and of course the idea here is that another point is you get this information or this possibility only, of course, if you have the PDB level snapshot activated. Okay, and then what I mentioned before that I wanted to show you, if I have the root level selected and I say, okay, show me the snapshots that the system has, I get a list. What you can see is basically that I have every hour one snapshot, and the last one was number 60. Okay, and now if I select the PDB level and I get the same list, Okay. First of all, you can see that a snapshot is taking place every half an hour. And in addition, it's a completely different snapshot ID. So also when you generate a report, maybe not in the interface because it's quite easy, let's say, to click on the stuff you need. But if you want to generate them, for example, directly in SQL Plus or a script, be careful that, I mean, there are different snapshots. And also something good, in my opinion, it's the fact that you can configure a much kind of higher frequency of snapshot only for specific PDBs that are maybe more important. And then for, let's say at the CDB level, you can say, okay, the default one in 1 hour is maybe easy enough. But for some specific PDB, you can also increase the, again, the frequency of the snapshots. Okay. So at least this thing was correctly implemented. So, and that was more or less what I prepared for this session. Just a summary at the end. I would say SQL Trace, as we have seen, there are not really much differences. The only thing which is a bit disturbing, you have no PDB level trace directory. So it's not really possible or easy to give access to the OS to someone, and this person can only access the trace generated by one PDB. Okay. So again, for me, the best way to deal with that is at least 12.2 and later release is to use the dynamic performance views instead. Okay. Otherwise, the rest of the workload is exactly the same. For the dynamic performance views, as we have seen, it's, let's say, it provides expected results. Just be careful that there are some views that gives you information at system level, PDB level, or whatever. Okay, so you might need to change some of the scripts you are using. And in AWR, as we just noticed, it's possible to create reports mainly if you activate the feature since 12.2 at 2 levels. But I will say, if possible, always generate a report at the container level so that you have an overview of about everything which is going on. Again, you have to remember that we are talking about a case where we want to look at the past. So we already have not many information about it. And if in addition we have no idea who else is working on the system, it's really difficult to do a decent analysis. Okay. So maybe you start at the CDB level, and then if you notice, nobody else is really consuming too much DB time, maybe you can just focus later on the PDB. But in general, I would say it's these kind of consolidation things introduce an additional level that's where you have to exclude that something is going on before going to the next step in the analysis. Okay, so in general, consolidation doesn't make things easier, but I mean it makes sense for making let's say if you have hundreds, if not thousands, of database to manage, it makes sense to use it. Okay. And the last point, weak support in Enterprise Manager. Honestly, I personally expect much more from the tool. Okay, so that's what I prepare for today. I don't know whether there are additional questions about what we have seen. Doesn't look like. So I think we are on time, which is not bad. So if you still have some time to stay with us, there will be outside some drinks, something to eat, more time to discuss whatever you want to discuss. And otherwise, I wish you an excellent evening and see you tomorrow morning. I wish you an excellent evening and see you tomorrow morning.